So today we're going to be talking about the 1968 movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, directed by Stanley Kubrick. Now I'll be blunt from the get-go. This movie is very divisive for me in terms of whether or not I truly like it or if I get bored to tears by it. Now, you think maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. Well, try having the first 3 minutes of this movie be a black screen. No music, nothing. Just pure black. I guess people like their coffee that way, but, considering I'm not that big of a coffee drinker, I'm not really a fan of this. And I don't even think coffee drinkers would be a fan of this either, because it might put them to sleep. Heck, they might order an extra cup of coffee. But enough about that. This movie starts out with 3 minutes of black, and then it does a lot of panning around, and you see all these visuals, and you see it's the beginning of man, and you see all these apes about 6 or 7 minutes in total, so about 3 minutes after the black screen ends. And then they have this entire scene with the apes, and you see that there's a territorial war going on between two tribes, and you see how they interact, and you see one of the tribes becomes victorious when they come across a watering hole, and then start taking dominance and going from there. And then the scene with the apes or the monkeys or whatever you want to call those hooligans ends with the monkey slamming down the bone, and the loud and brashing classical music comes into play. The bear, 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 that kind of thing. And then you get into space, and you're watching this for the first 20 minutes, and I had no idea what to expect from this movie. It's directed by Stanley Kubrick. I have enjoyed his other films that I have seen, such as A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. So I was probably had a bit of high expectations for this movie, and this is where I'm getting the mixed signals now. So you get into space, and you see there's this guy who has his family at home, and he's in space, and he's flying to the moon, where someone approaches him on his way there and says that they were stopped and couldn't land there, and he wants to know all the dirty secrets that the general has, and he just looks at them and says, "It's classified, I can't help you." And this man tries to plead with him and tries to get information out of him, but the general doesn't budge. And he even wishes his daughter happy birthday and wishes he could be there for her party. Now, as I was watching the commentary for this movie, it turns out that the daughter that he's talking to on this, essentially FaceTime for 1968, is actually Stanley Kubrick's daughter. And I thought that was a neat little tidbit to have her play this role. She seemed believable enough to me. They seemed like they were related, the general and his daughter in this movie. So that's fair. So then he actually flies out to the base on the moon, and it turns out it's this very top secret hush hush mission that he's on and is talking about, and they have a cover up story for this. Now, when the apes were coming together and figuring out who reigns over who, towards the end of this scene, they find this thing called a monolith, which you may have heard about from other people now, but that spoiled it for you. But it's basically this big black box, for a lack of a better word. It's very tall. It's probably about two or three times as tall as the apes themselves, and you don't really know what is in there. And later on, when I watched the commentary, I found out this is essentially a metaphor, an allegory for the extraterrestrial life. They just didn't really want to do anything with human representations of what aliens looked like, having moving and feeling parts. They just wanted to represent this big box as a way to show that there is this outside life that we didn't know about. So after this top secret meeting, it's discovered that they also have a monolith that was buried on the moon a long time before they got there. And they have been trying to figure out just what it's doing and how people can manage to be out there. And they send a crew out, and they explore, and you think, okay, we're going to figure out more about this monolith. Okay, we're going to figure out what's going to happen to them. Then it just cuts, and you're thinking, oh, I guess this general we've been following for the last 10 or 20 minutes, I guess he's all done. And speaking of the dialogue in this movie, there's no actual words until about minute 25 or minute 26. The exact count I had was 25 minutes and 41 seconds. But, tomato. So, what fills that time in between that doesn't have any dialogue to it? Well, it's a matter of the classical music that is the score for this movie, which I actually thought fit really well. I really thought it enhanced the story that was there. I thought that it fit with the overall mood of not having many words in the film, as Stanley Kubrick wanted, by the way. Originally, there was more dialogue in this movie, but he decided, for the sake of simplicity and having people absorb the visuals, that there should be less dialogue, and he went out of his way to intentionally remove the dialogue from the first 20 minutes and the last 20 minutes. Now, this movie is a very long movie in terms of the content that it has. It runs at 2.5 hours. Now, The Dark Knight also runs at 2.5 hours, but virtually every minute or every other minute of that 2.5 hours is filled with action, and you're moving from one minute to the next without looking at your watch. Here, I felt that there were a lot of places to pause. Speaking of pauses, so this movie really has a lot of pauses, in particular between the 3 minutes of black screen and then the 3 minutes of establishing landscape shots, and then the 15 or 20 minutes of the apes interacting with one another and then coming across a monolith. And then the next part goes into the general talking with his daughter, and then the people go to the moon, but there's all these loud sounds, and then it seems like they disappear. And then it moves to 18 months later on a Jupiter mission. And then here comes the most anticipated part of the movie, the HAL 9000. Now, the HAL part actually has a technical computer name, which for the H is one part and the AL is another. But the computer itself calls himself HAL, and that's what he wants you to call him too. So there's 5 astronauts on this ship going to Jupiter, but 3 of them are in hibernation trying to save up their air for closer times for when they get to the planet. And then there are 2 astronauts in space that are still talking and orbiting, and these are Frank and Dave. And as Hal is talking with them, he reminds Frank of his birthday after his parents wish him happy birthday, and Hal, wishes him happy birthdays too. And they talk about how this computer has a mind of its own and actually has emotions. And one thing about this movie that I did appreciate was that the computer actually has more emotions than humans do. Now, normally I would chalk this up to not the best of acting, but this was actually more intentional, I felt, because it humanized the computer and it computerized or, made the humans robots. And it was, I would say, a fairly good commentary on how the humans are becoming more like robots each day and letting the computers take over their lives. And that's not just limited to this movie. It's also, you can tie this up to how today's society interacts with technology. Heck, I'm recording off my webcam right now, and I'm going to be posting this to the internet, and I'll be sitting here on a video cam, essentially, the way that Stanley Kubrick's daughter did to the general. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. This goes back to the dividing points between this movie, though. At times, this movie is very philosophical. You can read a lot into it. You can read plenty into this movie, as I was just trying to do right then and there. But there's also a lot of dragging to this movie. And just because something is realistic doesn't mean it needs to be there. If it takes 10 whole minutes to board a spaceship, I don't think you need to show every seeking second to really make the point. Heck, you could probably show 6 or 7 minutes and, have all the highlights, have a little bit of lag time, but, have the movie feel like it's moving at a quicker pace. You know, when I walk into a movie theater or when I put in a movie on my TV or my Blu-ray, I'm not thinking, gee, I want to go right back into real life, the place I was just trying to escape. I'm thinking, shoot, I want to go to a new world. Take me there. So I've given this movie a pretty hard time, but that's not to say I don't like it. I do like this movie. I just feel that it has a bad case of snailitis and could use a bit of picking up the pace. But that being said, the certain things that I do like include the visuals, which, considering this was 1968, the year before Neil Armstrong went on to the moon and had his big step for mankind, the visuals in this are spectacular. And that's why I don't mind these scenes having a bit of length to them. I just think they're dragged out a bit too long. The establishing shots for the birth of man with all the apes, it's beautiful. That desert really does capture that essence of starting out and being primal beings. I think it's spectacular how it cuts from the ape throwing the bone into the sky and it hits something in space, and it's magnificent. And you may see that often nowadays with that match cut, as they call it, but for that time, it's spectacular. And the other thing is that the HAL 9000 computer is fascinating, and just how simultaneously emotional and cold-hearted this computer really is. And you don't really get to see his motives as to why he's just so cruel in this movie, but he's still an intriguing character. And I'll get to the discrepancies between why he wasn't really discussed in terms of where his evilness came from at a sooner point. So the other interesting thing about this movie is just the way things flow, the way things move. You do have this lingering thing, which does work at times. You have this building of suspense, this building of tension, and you're just thinking, oh my goodness, when is this going to end? Heck, this movie even has an intermission. An intermission! I didn't know I was in a play. That's the other thing. This movie, and I'm realizing I'm kind of devolving a bit into more critiques as opposed to insights or positive things here. But this movie consistently confused me in terms of, is this a ballet? Is this what is this? It really left me speechless. And considering the movie didn't have a lot of dialogue in its end, it was a pretty quiet experience. But I did have in my pages of notes the consistent 3 words in all caps followed by exclamation points and question marks of what the fuck? Simply put. But to the movie's credit, the slowness does help build up the tension. It's just that sometimes it leaves me starting to have my eyes go to sleep. Truthfully, I was happy that there's an intermission. That way I could get up and like take a break from this sucker and process as to what the hell just happened and what else is going to happen now. Something that's up for debate as well is the ending of this movie. Now, this being said, if you don't like spoilers, I may have spoiled with the HAL 9000, but I'm sorry, but he's hard not to talk about. But if you don't want to hear about the ending, spoilers, but this movie is almost 50 years old. I'm sure you've heard of this ending, or you could just Google it. Moving on. So, this movie ends with the surviving astronaut. So he's finally unplugged Hal from his existence. He figured out the way to hack into the large computer room, which I didn't realize this at first when I was watching this, but after hearing the commentary, I was like, oh, this was just one big computer. Wow, this is a huge room for one computer. And that's where I felt that I was definitely much younger than this movie expected me to be. Anyhow, the surviving astronaut comes in through the emergency exit. He unplugs Hal's memory. Hal actually starts to get emotional, which is strange to think about. The computer getting even more emotional and having his final song and just straight up dying. It's bizarre, as if it was a human. Ugh, it's spooky. Anyway, the astronaut is safe now, so he goes on this voyage to Jupiter, and there's a kaleidoscope of colors, which is why I can't complain too much about sitting there for a long time, because you're seeing all these colors pass, and this is, before a lot of digital enhancement. They actually had quite a few thousand, if not many, many more pictures just floating through and cycling through and showing Dave's, the surviving astronaut's face every now and then to show that he's still moving through all of this. And it does get a bit trippy, and I like trippy. It's fun. I think it's better if I don't have to go on the trip itself, but I get to ride the roller coaster. It's a much better way to go through life than actually taking the trip and opening yourself up to risky things happening to you. But I digress. So he goes through this whole kaleidoscope of many, many, many colors, and then he comes into this room, which of course is very Kubricky in all of its spread out nature and its contrast of greens and whites, and he sees this old man sitting at the table with a glass of water, and he's in his astronaut suit as well. So there's two versions of him existing here, but they're both aged, except he looks probably about 30 years older than he originally was, but the man in front of him is about 50 years older than he originally was, so a 20-year difference. And you see this man at the table reach for a glass, and he ends up shattering it, and then he disappears. And each younger version disappears. So the youngest one disappears first. The original Dave disappears, and then you see the man at the table reaching for his glass, and it breaks, and he looks, and then things start disappearing, and he looks around, and he looks at the bed that pops up out of nowhere, and there's this version even 20 years older than the old man at the table, and this man looks like the crib keeper if he lived a few hundred more years. And he's laying in bed, and he's just not looking well. And then he sees this monolith. Ugh. I actually like seeing the monoliths, don't get me wrong, but it was just, really? How? I probably just wanted more explanations, and truth be told, that is not Kubrick's style. The difference here is that in the other movies of Kubrick's, where he actually has his visuals, they talk in their own way. The visuals here don't really tell you much of anything. They're just there to look cool, and they look great. They look awesome. But I'm not informed about this. And the fact of the matter is, this movie also has a counterpart of a book. The problem is that when the book and the movie were being made, at one point they were on the same playing ground. They were being written or made from the same material. Then, as the book was being written, the movie deviated from that original material, while the book did not. So you end up having two different versions of the same story. And on top of that, there were a lot of things in the book that explained what was going on in the movie, but the movie decided, screw it, we don't want to explain this movie to people. And you could chalk that up to letting the viewer put some of his imagination, or her imagination, whatever, to work. But there's a fine line between having context clues and then building your own story, and then looking at a blank screen for the first 3 minutes, and then feeling like you keep looking at it for the rest of the damn movie. There's a big difference. We need context clues. it's one thing to make your own story, but it's kind of hard to make a story out of thin air. Unless you're Kubrick, and then he can make a fucking pinata out of it. But I'm gonna move on from that. So, this guy is the crypt keeper, and he sees a monolith, right? And you'll notice it goes from one character to the next character, seeing another character, and the next character sees another character. Well, this crypt keeper sees the monolith, right? And he's like, oh my gosh, what is this? And as you bounce back from the monolith to the bed, there's now a large fetus. What? What? This is another moment of mine where I had those three lovely words scrawled out in all caps on my note paper. What the fuck? And then the next thing I know, this fetus is orbiting and it's looking upon the earth, and it just has this strange stare or glare or glance, whatever. And it's looking at the screen and you're thinking, what is this? And then the movie ends. What? Okay, maybe I'm overreacting a bit. Probably the mistake that I made was after watching this 2.5 hours of not even knowing what the hell was going on, I decided I wanted to know more. And so I watched the commentary directly after watching the 2.5 hour movie to try to process it. So I spent 5 hours in a row. Now, of course, this is not a real life or death problem. This is what some would call a first world problem, but this is just me saying, things could be much, much worse. Alright, I'll fess up to that. My point is, I watched the commentary to get more insight, and unlike Epic Movie, where I got angrier at the movie being made, I actually had more appreciation for the movie being made for 2001. So we talked with the two actors, in this case, Frank and Dave, the ones that played them, and it was just a very interesting experience because they actually wanted to work with Kubrick from the get-go. They both cited the movie Paths of Glory, and I will be figuring out more about that and talking about that at a later date. But I digress. So one of the actors had actually been playing football at the time, and he was so in awe of Stanley Kubrick when he was actually called up to play the part of being like your standard average man going into space, that he skipped football practice, made up some big lie, and traveled out to the other part of California. Now, most of the movie here was actually filmed in England, which doesn't surprise me too much, considering A Clockwork Orange was also filmed in England, and while those two movies aren't really quite the same at all, they both have that, not just the Kubrick name, but the Kubrick feel. And they were roughly 3 years apart, Clockwork Orange being in 1971, whereas the 2001 A Space Odyssey was made in 1968, or rather, released in 1968, and production started 3 years before. Something else that's amazing about this too is just all the technology that went into this movie. These days, it could be a lot easier to make critiques like I'm doing right now and say, what about this? What about that? But the fact that we hadn't even been on the moon yet, and we didn't have all the access to personal computers even, and the fact that this movie really had a lot of things right about it, it's pretty impeccable when you really think about it. Now, of course, I've talked about the snail's pace a million times, and maybe I'm a little spoiled. I'll cut the movie some slack on that, but when you have me checking my watch, and this is supposed to be one of the top rated movies, I start to question why it is that way. Now, as I said, there are two main camps for this. There's the camp that think this is a masterpiece of God and is the best movie ever. And then there's the other camp that thought this was a slow, boring piece of crap. I don't think it's stuff that you would flush down the toilet. I think it is a good movie. I think it's worth watching. But you need to keep in mind that this is not your everyday movie. That there is a bit more to think about. You do have to fill in the blanks a little bit more. you have a lot more of your brain that you actually have to use, which if you're just in the mood to veg out and turn off your brain, this is not going to be your movie. But if you want to sit there and absorb all of the visual wonder that Stanley Kubrick puts together and have a philosophical discussion that you really can get into, you really can. And there's a lot of speculation you can make about this movie. And in fact, Stanley Kubrick himself never provided a clear answer as to what everything was supposed to mean. He wanted the viewer to actually think for themselves on this one. But he wanted to have a visual representation. And if they wanted to read more, then they could read the book. Now, I am of the camp that you should not have to read a book to understand the movie. I really am, because I think a movie should stand on its own. But I think it's fair to have a few, things in context that are clarified when you have read the book and then you watch the movie. I have personally not read the book, and I probably will not read the book, but I feel like it would be worthwhile to read. But even if you don't do that, at least take this movie and give it a spin. I would say it's worthwhile. Just come prepared, knowing that it can be a bit slow, but that it is worth a ride. It's a pretty movie, for one thing. It's an interesting movie. It's a thought-provoking movie. It does make you ask those questions, and it is very, very open to discussion. And the rating that I give this, even though it is going to be at the bottom of the 5 movies that I reviewed so far, it's still a B plus. I still think it's worth going out of your way to see. But that being said, I felt that the other movies on this list that I reviewed so far were better. And that's all I have for this movie. And this was a lot of fun to do. And I hope y'all have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed this. And I will be working on my next movie for this list. It's the movie called Seven, also with the number 7 in the title. And normally that's a bit of a silly thing to do, but that's okay. I've heard great things about this movie, and I'm excited about the premise. It's essentially this killer who kills based on the 7 deadly sins. And I'm sure there's a lot more to it, but I'm excited to dive in and figure out just what it's all about. And so just stay tuned as I work on that one. And if you guys have any requests or anything, just let me know. All feedback is appreciated. I'm really wanting to know more about just what I can do to make this experience more entertaining. And feel free to subscribe. All right. Y'all are a lot of fun. Have a good day now. Bye.